Welcome to today's event of the Future of Utilities and Climate Change Goals. Today's Energy Central Power Session is brought to you in partnership with Utility 2030 Collaborative. So just to go over a few housekeeping notes, we would like to mention, if you cannot get adequate sound from your computer speakers, you may dial into the audio portion using the telephone numbers listed in the right-hand panel of your interface under the audio section. We have a built-in few times during today's power sessions where we will pause and we'll bring in questions from the audience. So if you have questions you'd like to ask, please be sure to enter them into the chat featured in the interface, and we can bring you or your questions into the conversation when the time is right. Now, I would like to turn it over to our moderator, Param Kumar, President of Kumar Resources, representing Utility 2030 Collaborative, to kick things off. Kumar, over to you.
Thank you, Christina. First of all, it's a pleasure to talk to our panelists and you, the audience. And first of all, I want to thank our sponsors, Energy Central with Audra and PJ, Utility 2030 with Christina Corcoran, and Customized Energy Solutions, or CES, with Dr. Rahul Palawakar. Thank you, folks. Climate change is one of those subjects that it's beginning to be in the same class as politics and religion, in the sense that it involves very strong emotions on one hand, and at the same time some cold analytics on the other, and the fight between them has not been pretty. Whether you're one of those hardcores like me who believe that this is an existential threat, or you're somebody who believes that this is all some sort of conspiracy, the fact of the matter is you have to face facts as they are. And so, it's more difficult, it's easier said than done, obviously. And the way I try to eliminate those arguments is by invoking Blaise Pascal's famous wager on the existence of God. The way you want to, Pascal's theory was that if you have to bet on whether God exists or not. If you bet that God does exist and you lose the bet, your losses are minimal, maybe a few hours spent in praying. Whereas if you bet that he does not exist and you lose that bet, then you are condemned to eternal damnation for infinity. So if you do a very simple probabilistic calculation of expected value of returns, you're better off betting that God exists. To some extent, that is the kind, some sort of an approach that we need to take here also, in the sense that the consequences of climate change are so severe that you have to take that very seriously, whether you have a gut feel of whether you believe in it or not. And so therefore, that's my premise for the starting point, that you have to worry about it. And whether you caused it, whether you're the reason for the problem or not, it is your problem and you have to solve it. And anyway you look at it, energy, the generation, the transportation, and the consumption of energy is pretty much at the center of the whole climate change discussions and consequences. There is energy in terms of utilities producing energy as an end-use product, but even otherwise, in other sectors such as transportation, for example, the basic dirty, a lot of the basic quote-unquote dirtiness does come from the fact that they have to generate energy to keep them moving. So energy is at the center, and fundamentally, generation of electricity is dirty, in the sense that whether you're producing carbon byproducts by burning fossil fuels, or you're using extremely toxic rare earth chemicals to create those wonderful solar panels, it's fundamentally dirty. So there is no such thing as clean energy. That you can come up with mechanisms to contain the damage that is being done in the production, which is why we, as part of the energy and the utility industry, have to be very aware and conscious of what we are doing and how we're doing it. So I want to, rather than take up too much time, I want to turn it over to the panelists. The way I'd like to do this is I want to, call on the panelists one at a time, and I would like you to spend 3 to 5 minutes discussing, talking about one or two issues which you think are very critical from your point of view. The wonderful thing is that we have a panel who bring very different viewpoints to this discussion. They're all coming from extremely different angles at the same problem, and that you will realize that as soon as they start talking, you'll absolutely realize it. And by the way, all of these people are extremely passionate about their beliefs. So once again, you know, when I was when somebody was asking me how I'm going to do the moderation, my opinion was that it wasn't a question of whether I can get these people to talk. It was a question of how I'm going to get them to stop talking. So please be aware of our time limitations, and 3 to 5 minutes. But before that, before we even get started on the opening statements, I want to call on Mitchell Beer. Mitchell is the publisher and managing editor of the Energy Mix. Over the last few months, Mitchell has been my tutor in all things climate change, and we did a couple of a few sessions of a podcast on COP26 Glasgow conference. And so I'd like Mitchell to take a few minutes and take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about some critical issues that were at the center of the discussion in the COP26, and especially buzzwords. And it's important to understand those buzzwords because they tend to steer the discussion in terms of what is and what is not going to get done. So Mitchell, you want to take it away?
Thanks very much, Kumar, and everybody. Thank you for being here today. Kumar, I really enjoyed your introduction, and it means that I need to ad-lib in this starting point, and that is that the climate emergency is not a conspiracy or a myth, and I really hope that is not news to most people participating today. It's all around us. Maybe the easier bet, if we're into making bets, is not whether what we're seeing is climate change, but whether you are seeing the risks and impacts, whatever you want to call them, that most of us and all the responsible science attribute to climate change brought on by human activity. In the work we do, in the publishing we do, we really try not to get into arguments with people who don't see the same source of the problem. If we can come to agreement on the solutions, that ain't nothing, and that's a good enough place to start. COP26, we were, the three of us, Kumar and Christina and I, we were together every weekday during the event, dissecting what was going on. And what we saw was that there were so many dimensions to the issue and to what was being discussed at the conference. The buzzwords, the jargon matter because the UN climate process is one of those settings that have language all their own. And you know, the best analogy that comes to mind for today is that people in a utility or an ISO control room need their own set of specialized jargon to do what they do. And it's a mistake, and it's dangerous to take that away from them. And yet that language is pretty opaque to the rest of us. So I still remember the first COP that I attended, I was just horrified as a writer, as a communicator, at the language, at the opacity of it. By about my fourth, I think it gets easier to follow, and it's really important to be able to get at some of the basic concepts, as you said, beginning with the distinction between climate mitigation versus adaptation, where mitigation refers to the steps we have to take to quickly and effectively reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whereas adaptation is adapting to the effects of climate change now and in the future. Loss and damage is a whole separate concept, and that refers to the unavoidable impacts of climate change that it's impossible to recover from. Okay, you're a small island state and you're going to be underwater in 2100. Pretty much whatever happens. You're in a coastal community that is routinely inundated. You can't farm anymore because the rising seas have literally salted the earth. The earth will not produce anymore. And there's a very live conversation at the COP right now that you'll see coming up again later this year as well, and in the time between, about the compensation that vulnerable countries should be entitled to as a result of that. All of this leads into something that I think we're going to be hearing about later in the session, and that is the continuing failure of international negotiations and international equity through the COP process in a way that factors in some historical realities that there's a relatively small proportion of countries that have produced the lion's share of the emissions over time, and a whole other group, for the most part, of countries that are experiencing by far the worst impacts of climate change, not in the future, but right now, today. It's happening as we speak. And that leads into a continuing conversation about climate finance, international climate finance, and about technology transfer, so that the countries, particularly developing, well, so that developing countries can be full participants in the transition that needs to take place, and that in many sense they need more and more immediately than anyone else. If I still have time, Kumar, there are a couple of other points I can cover, but I don't want to take more than my share of the time here by any means.
Go ahead, Mitchell.
Okay, just quickly. There were a number of major milestones that you may have heard about, may have been following closely during COP26. Delegates gathered in Glasgow at a moment, frankly, of just breathtaking failure, in the sense that in 2009 at the climate conference in Copenhagen, the wealthy countries had agreed that by 2020, they would, among them, assemble $100 billion per year in climate finance for the vulnerable countries that I was referring to earlier. The $100 billion figure was one that they came up with themselves. I wasn't involved with it at the time, but my understanding is that they didn't bother consulting anyone. It was just the nifty round figure they came up with, and they gave themselves 11 years to meet the deadline, which they didn't. 2020 was the pandemic year, so it became 2021, and just before this year's COP, we learned that the negotiations had failed, and that in fact the funds were not going to be provided. So that set the tone for a lot of what happened and didn't happen at COP26. We did see strong national commitments from countries like India and China in the course of the conference. Some of them expected, some not. There was just in the first few days, and again, Kumar and Christina, you'll remember this well, just this flow of announcements and initiatives and milestones. A number of countries agreeing together through the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance to begin scaling back their oil and gas production. Financial institutions and asset holders, asset managers with $130 trillion worth of assets in their control, agreeing together to reduce the carbon impact of those assets, and a bunch of others. Three things are true about that. First of all, that most of those side agreements stood outside the formal process around implementing the Paris Climate Agreement, which meant that people could make whatever promises they wanted inside the halls. They set momentum, but they were basically immaterial because they did not take place as part of the official process. There were also caveats on all of the announcements. I don't think we saw one go by without, some gaps, some limitations, some serious question coming up within about 24 hours or less. At the same time, out in the world, outside the COP setting, the momentum coming out of the conference was unmistakable, and it gives all of us both an obligation and so many different hooks and opportunities to take effective action over the year before everybody gathers at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh later this year. And in COP speak, maybe one piece of jargon is that delegates and diplomats love talking about the direction of travel. It took me a while to wrap my head around that one, but at this point, I would say that the opportunities for the direction of travel we need in some ways are stronger outside the COP process than inside. Over to you, Kumar.
Mitchell. Thank you, Mitchell. That certainly was a very, very quick update on the 10 days of COP26. And by the way, in case anyone is interested, you can go to Energy Central, and we have posted links to all the 10 of those podcasts that were the daily podcast during COP26. And so now we come to Aliénor Rouget. Aliénor Rouget is a program manager at the Environmental Defense Canada. Ali, as we have Americanized her name, represents the new force that was very evident, that was very much prominent and in the forefront in COP26, which is youth activism and young activists. And my first reaction to that was obviously, it just proves my Pascal theory, because they have a lot more to lose than senior citizens like me and a supermajority of the US Senate. So clearly, the youngsters are the ones that are going to have to carry the torch forward. So, and when I was talking with Ali previously, one of her main focuses is what's called just transition. Another buzzword, but think of it as not just a matter of reducing carbon emissions and technical matters like that, but think of it more as a way of introducing change so that the entire world ends up at a better place than it is. So tomorrow we can all breathe easier in more ways than one in our environment. Over to you, Ali.
Thank you very much, Kumar. Hi, folks. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be amongst these panelists. As Kumar was saying, my name is Aliana, or Ali. I work with Environmental Defense Canada. There's also an Environmental Defense US, so I have to make that distinction clearly. I'm working there on some of our climate and energy files, so very relevant to today's conversation, obviously. A lot of the work that I do entails our campaign on the just transition for workers and communities. And that's a really big question for Canada, for Canada's economy, but it's also one that obviously applies to many places in the US. And actually there's many places that have started using that phrase and planning around a just transition. A lot of proposed bills right now actually relate to or directly mention the just transition. I also work within environmental events on topics of reclamation, cleaning up behind oil and gas industry. And so again, a lot of my work thinks about how do we make sure this transition to the clean economy, the clean energy, is done without leaving people behind or without leaving entire communities behind. But I've also been organizing for years as a youth activist. I was doing a lot of the school climate strikes. And so I'd also be delighted to answer some of your questions on that if that's of interest eventually. But today I hope to share more about the just transition. It was mentioned at COP, and so we can talk about it in the context of COP26, but in general, it's going to be a big topic every time you speak about energy transitions. And I'll say that there's many scales at which you could talk about it. Obviously, on the global scale, a just transition could be how do we help countries that haven't yet completely used fossil fuels to develop and grow? How do we use them, help them leapfrog to clean energy sources right away? That could be one of them. But what I work on is much more for the rich countries, the countries that have benefited from all this fossil fuel exploitation and burning. How do we transition them? And it's a question because our countries in Canada and the US especially have a bit of an addiction to fossil fuels, economically, but also politically, and sometimes even culturally. And so there's really a shift that needs to happen within our countries. So I'll also start with having as a given that the climate crisis is an issue, like my fellow panelists, but I also say that I take it as a given that we need to transition away from fossil fuels to address the climate crisis. And I hope that you can join me in this assumption. It's one that's backed by science. Even the International Energy Agency has stated that we need to transition away from it, not just tomorrow. It's going to be over time. It's going to take time. It can be thought through, but we do need to do that. So that's the premise I'm taking as well. And so maybe to get us started, to prompt this conversation, I wanted to share my current understanding of what just transition means, because Kumar, you were right to point out it is a buzzword. It's everywhere, but at the same time, it doesn't mean anything just in itself. And there are many definitions out there. There are even some people that support the idea but don't like the term. So just use this as a draft to help your thinking, and don't maybe take it to word for word. So to me, I've defined it as being a response to the climate emergency. And so the just transition as a response to the climate emergency allows us to rapidly decarbonize our economy while ensuring that workers and communities that would be affected by this rapid decarbonization are given good lives and good jobs in a new economy. So that's how I see it. It's really this process. And when you listen to that, you understand that there's almost two components. There's the first one that's making sure people that have existing jobs or lives that depend on polluting industries and helping them transition somewhere else. And that's where we talk about economic diversification, creating new jobs, bridging to retirement, or retraining people. That's the first part. But there's also that second part that's saying we got to make sure those who were historically maybe hurt by those polluting industries or historically excluded from good opportunities to even work in these industries, we got to bring them in. We got to build that new economy with them in. That's part of the transition too. So that adds complexity, but that's okay. You all seem like folks that are willing to engage with complexity, and that's kind of how I understand the just transition. So happy to talk about this in more detail after. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to hearing fellow panelists as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Ali. Next, we turn to Diane Cherry. Diane is the principal at Cherry Consulting. You know, after the note from Ali, you know, that we know the old expression, you know, think globally, act locally. And so Diane is probably the best fit to talk about a certain area. Diane specializes on the southeastern United States in terms of energy policies, as well as all of the initiatives the states and the utilities are undertaking in this part of the world. I'm at the northern tip of her territory. I'm in Maryland. And so if you could talk about some concrete areas of interest to you, as well as what you think ought to be done, and what is indeed going on today with the utilities, as well as the state and local regulations, that would be very helpful. Over to you, Diane.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad to join you guys all on the panel. And I'm excited about people like Ali to think about the advocacy for the youth. I think that's so incredibly important as one of many things that she's doing. As he said, I work on energy related issues in the Southeast, primarily clean energy. I have a client base that includes everyone from local governments to clean energy businesses to higher education and advocacy groups, all thinking about how to move from where we are to a clean energy in the future. And I sort of bucket the Southeast because the Southeast is really unique in thinking about transitioning a region for many reasons. One is that we have a high energy consumption per capita. So as a region, it tends to be a little more energy inefficient. It's a very energy intensive economy, meaning it has manufacturing, data centers, technology, 24/7, you know, high energy intensive users, the military. And so it's unlike California and New England, which are much more, their economies are not built on energy in the way that it is in the Southeast. So they also have in the Southeast a continued reliance on coal and desire to transition out of that. But we also have a growing population. So when you put all of that together, a high energy per capita, a very energy intensive economy, a continued reliance on coal to get out of coal into other sources, as well as the demands of a growing population, it makes for an extremely difficult challenge to do. The other thing that makes this area of the country unique is that we do not have a energy market in the way that the rest of the country does. So by that I mean a regional transmission organization for which there's a way to lower emissions and move the transition more quickly. And it makes it more complex. So you actually have to think about the Southeast as a whole for two factors. One is state policy. How does a particular state in the Southeast think about carbon reductions? And then what is the utility leadership? And so when you put all of that together, That's really how I think about it. But what's happening is that our integrated resource plans, which are the utilities generation portfolio to the future, is getting rid of or dealing with that legacy coal, but replacing it with natural gas in many cases far into the future. Even though the utilities have pledged a carbon reduction of 0 emissions past 2050, not past 2050, with the exception of NextEra, who is in the Florida area, you know, natural gas still is on the grid. And so then there's just a whole lot of questions about, you know, whether natural gas is going to end up as a stranded asset in the way that coal has done. What does that mean for the backs of consumers who are ratepayers? We have some of the persistent poverty in the country. North Carolina has 13% persistent poverty. You know, Mississippi is even worse. And so what do you do with that when you have legacy systems and rate increases? The other thing that we have is issues related to a state that has a carbon goal. We have only 2 in the Southeast, Virginia and North Carolina, but we have utilities that work across different geographic boundaries. So for example, Duke Energy is in North Carolina and South Carolina, and there was an interest in doing the carbon reduction that the North Carolina Utilities Commission is doing in both their territories. And the South Carolina utilities and the Attorney General of South Carolina said, there's no way you're dealing with it in 2 jurisdictions. We're not, you know, we're not going to go there. So you have all of these complicated nuances, if you will, related to how to get to a transition, and many more, not just individual commitments from the utilities, but also you have, like I said, state policy, and you have many cities that are all coming together and saying, we want to go to a clean energy, you know, carbon neutrality by a certain date in the future. And those can be more at a timetable that's earlier than both the state policy or the utility in that area. So for example, Atlanta, Columbia, South Carolina, Orlando, St. Petersburg, Florida, Asheville, North Carolina, Durham, North Carolina, all of these states, Charlotte, have all said we want to go to a carbon neutrality goal. And in many cases, they are ahead of the state policy, or in our case, national policy. And all of that, I'm just going to end with one more point, which is the other thing that's really complicated now is the Biden administration and the environmental community's goal, which is to advocate for 0 emissions from the US electricity sector by 2035. And in many cases, these IRPs that I was talking about for utilities keep coal and natural gas for much longer than that. And so how do you balance all of that out? And I'll just leave it there because there's a lot of different nuances that you can go into, but I think it just kind of sets up the conversation and how difficult it is, but for which there's a lot of opportunity for clean energy.
Thank you, Diane. In fact, picking up on what you said just now, a lot of arguments that are being leveled in favor of a long-term natural gas, for example, is reliability. That somehow the renewable sources, the intermittency of the renewable sources cannot offer the degree of reliability that the traditional fossil fuels or nuclear can, which of course is, you know, in my personal opinion, but you know, I will get to Rahul in 1 second because he is probably far more qualified to talk about this than I am. In my opinion, saying that that's the way to solve the reliability problem is a complete absence of imagination, in the sense that there are new technologies coming on the market. There are new folks like Rahul are working on these very smart people like Rahul are working on these technologies. Rahul is a rare combination of a geek and a policy wonk. He holds a PhD and an MBA from Carnegie Mellon, and he's also the managing director of CES, Customized Energy Solutions India. So Rahul, I'd love to have you address the question of reliability and some of the new emerging technologies you and your staff have been working on in India, such as storage as well as microgrids. and at the same time also address some unique aspects of the policy that the Indian government has embraced recently, because in all honesty, not much play has been done in the Western media about some of the actual advances that countries like India have done. They tend to clump India and China as into one group and say they're not doing anything, which is simply not true in both cases. But so Rahul, take it away.
Sure. Thank you very much, Param. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be on the panel hosted by Energy Central. I have been a reader of Energy Central since probably 2003. So it's good to be on a panel. And I think this topic is very, very important and I think very relevant for all of us globally. I think, Param, as you mentioned, the potential challenges and risks are so critical that we need to act. But the best part about it, the way I see it, is that it is no longer about the cost, because traditionally people have tried to fight against the all the evidence related to the climate change was saying that no, the immediate cost for next century is going to be so high that we don't want to take that risk in our lifetime. Whatever may happen for our children or grandchildren, we don't care, but at least we don't want to pay for that cost. Whereas I think the way we should be now looking at the coming 2 or 3 or even next 5 decades is going to be the, I think as Jigar Shah talks about it, is about creating the climate wealth, because we are right at the cusp where we are, many of these technologies which can actually help avoid the climate disasters are actually turning out to be the cheapest way of providing access to the energy. And only some challenges related to the reliability, maybe with renewables, with the variability. That was something which earlier again was being seen that once you start getting renewables beyond 30, 40, 50% of the grid, you will not be able to tackle it. But now with emergence of advanced energy storage technologies, I think that paradigm is also changing. Many of these technologies in last maybe 10 to 15 years have seen exponential reductions of both solar as well as advanced storage technologies like lithium-ion batteries have had 10x reduction in the price, capital price of these technologies within last 10 to 12 years. So again, just to say once again, so that if audience members are not following the prices, when in 2008, 2009, when we as a CES were starting to look at grid scale energy storage deployment, lithium-ion batteries were costing more than $1,000 per kilowatt hour at cell level, whereas now we are getting to price points which are at below $100 per kilowatt hour at cell level. So this is a 10x kind of a reduction, and by doing that, and at the same time, solar energy has become the cheapest source available from at one time where it was seen as a technology which is used for satellites or just for its green nature by paying premium. Solar has become a cheapest source of energy. In fact, in India, we are now getting solar at below 3 cents at a large grid scale, and it is competing with all the fossil fuel energy sources. So I think we are entering this phase where there are a lot of opportunities around the globe where if we can keep up with the pace of technology change, if we can learn from some of the early adopters and focus on improving the manufacturing, scaling up the manufacturing, and then do it in an environmentally conscious way, then I think around the globe we can completely transform this narrative in terms of fighting against cost. And Param, you raised one important point about in terms of India getting clubbed with sometimes China, or obviously with statistics, it's always always tricky, because you can just put the statistics in different way and use the same data for having a completely different narrative. If we just talk about in terms of the total emissions or the total energy consumption, then yes, India is amongst the top 5 in the world, just given the size of the country and the population. But if you start thinking about many of the statistics on a per capita basis, then Indian consumers are consuming less than 1/10 of the electricity per capita as compared to consumers in US or Canada. If you talk about transportation sector, India has less than 25 cars per 1,000 people versus I believe the US, the numbers are close to 800 cars for 1,000 people. So many of these things where again, in terms of the just number of total emissions or the energy consumption, India does stand at amongst top 5. but not even comparing it with US. If you compare India's energy consumption or emissions with China, India is still on a per capita basis 1/4 of both energy consumption as well as pollution as compared to China. So I think there is still a long way to go for India. But the great part is the current political leadership has taken many progressive steps. For example, when the current government took into power back in 2014, they scaled up the national target for solar energy from 20 gigawatt for 22 to 100 gigawatt for 22 for solar, and India is already almost on verge of achieving that target. In fact, in Paris, India had given a target or commitment for reaching to 40% of India's installed capacity by renewables, and already in 22, India has almost achieved that target. India has crossed 39%, almost 7-8 years ahead, which I don't think any other country has matched that. And it is not just about the 22, but India is continuing to grow and add many areas. For example, earlier last year, the Prime Minister has announced now a national mission on green hydrogen, and that is not necessarily competing with renewables or batteries for existing electrical application, but that is actually with a focus on decarbonizing industrial sector, fertilizers, petrochemical sectors, which are hard to abate sectors just with electricity. So a lot of things are happening, and I firmly believe that this coming decade is going to be the decade for wealth creation by adopting these technologies.
Thank you, Rahul. That is quite interesting in the sense of, there you have a view of the future, which is not looking in the rearview mirror. In other words, yes, we understand that there are problems, reliability problems, and the problem that extends beyond just, producing and, being a utility and producing electricity and sending it to people's homes. And it extends to other sectors as well. And there are that is the most heartening thing that has been coming out over the last few years, in the sense that there's a lot more of imagination that is driving, as opposed to go back to traditional, good old, tried and true, quote unquote, tried and true solutions. But we all know where the dial-up phone went, right? So picking up on that, Mitchell, you've heard some of this discussion right now, and so one question I want to ask you is, out of COP26 came a lot of goals, promises, assurances, etc. If I were the CEO of a utility company in North America today, what would you think I should go, and how do you think I should do? What and how should I go ahead and onboard these messages onto my organization and make sure that I am actually somehow contributing to meeting these global goals as well as local regulations, especially today when there are so many financial, especially financial pressures, including financial, on the utilities.
Thanks, Kumar. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that Rahul just gave you one of the, or for many, the best reason, and that is that the transition is rapidly becoming the least cost energy path. The one thing that I would add to what we've just heard, and this always needs to be added, is efficiency first. That the cheapest unit of electricity or fuel is always the unit you never need to generate or extract. So that the first step for any institution, pretty much anywhere, and this is about as close to a universal statement as we get, I think, in this work, the first step is always to look to every opportunity to reduce demand, to manage demand better, so that the remaining supply that you need to meet is less of a tough challenge. But then from there, recognize the really just mind-boggling cost information that we've just heard and that we've all been seeing over the past number of years. From there, I think a couple of points that I would suggest. One, and this is to pick up on remarks earlier, to recognize that the crisis is upon us. And whether you want to define it as the climate crisis or the wacky weather crisis or the deep freeze that killed 700 people crisis or the fire crisis that burned Paradise, California, literally burned Paradise to the ground in California, Anybody who works in utilities, I think by now knows or needs to know that those effects are with us today, not next generation. They are getting worse, and honestly, that's going to happen, whatever you want to attribute it to. It's going to continue happening. And from there, the cost of not acting now will accrue over time because the solutions get more expensive and frankly less convenient when you have to implement them over a shorter time span. The risk of stranded assets, certainly stranded coal assets, and a lot of the analysis is saying stranded gas assets, that becomes much more of a significant risk for utilities over time. And again, the longer you wait, the more expensive and the more institutionally painful it gets. And I think the equal and opposite piece of the conversation is that so far, all of us have been framing this for the most part the way we usually hear the transition framed, you know, and it's not, I think, usually said out loud this way, but the sort of the tone, the feel that we've all gathered over the months and years and some of us decades is, okay, fine, we know we need to do this, but if like taking your medicine, it's gonna hurt, but I have to do this because someone told me I have to. The, you know, the COVID update to that would be, okay, I have to take my booster, maybe I'll only be down for half a day after, right? But it's gonna hurt. That's not true in this case. One of the, I think, fundamental cornerstones we've been missing is to recognize that this transition is not about loss and pain. It's about opportunity and gain, right? And in, you know, among the many things I found fascinating in Diane's presentation just now, the idea that North Carolina has 13% persistent poverty. It's worse in Mississippi. So if that's where people are living right now, what is going to be of greater interest to them and to anybody who's listening to them? The carbon footprint of the excessive energy that their poorly or non-insulated homes are using at all times of year? Or the fact that if we get this right, they will no longer have to choose between food and fuel? Which of those lenses is most important for doing something that's been recommended in Canada over the last year, and that is to take on a national retrofit mission that can save, the number's not in my head, but I think it's 10 terawatt hours of electricity across our country, just by getting the inefficiencies out of the system. All of that electricity then becoming available for other uses without needing a stitch of new supply up to that point. There are so many of those benefit arguments that are absolutely real, and frankly, a lot more real to your investors, your stakeholders, your customers, than the necessarily abstract conversations that we often have around climate and around energy transition. And if we started from the outcome that we want and then move back to right now and start projecting forward, so what do we need to do to get there? And what are the benefits? That changes the conversation immediately, and I think in a really important and constructive way.
Diane, I saw you agreeing with some of what Mitch was saying. So would you like to add something?
Sure. I think the issue of stranded assets is really important because like RMI, Rocky Mountain Institute, has done analysis looking at, you know, utility IRPs, integrated resource plans, and sort of where is natural gas going to line up against coal as we've seen that tilt into IRPs. And they find that 60% of them are going to be a stranded asset, much like coal, by the 2030, around the 2030 timeline. So if you take that argument and then you take the argument of, you know, 1.5% or 1.5 degrees Celsius is where we need to be, we have to get all of the coal assets off by 2030. But we see IRPs that have them on past 2030. So we're not going to meet the 1.5%, or 1.5 degrees. So those two things kind of just are factually there. So then you get to, okay, so what do we do with, if we're not going to meet what climatically we need to do, and we're going to end up in the case where infrastructure investments are going to be not there, what can we do to get renewables on the grid quickly? Well, that means transmission, which is a huge issue. That's the infrastructure that we ought to invest in. The issue is always like, who pays for it? Does the last project in the queue have to take that entire hit. There's been a lot of queue reform, looking at, PJM right now is going through a huge queue reform conversation. Some of the states have done the same thing to try to get those questions answered. But I also think there's some fundamental questions about reliability versus variability. And I feel people sometimes get themselves stuck into those conversations. When people talk about, well, don't you want reliable energy? I don't know anyone who would say, you know what, I don't want reliable energy. I'd be happy without unreliable energy. So let's just take the reliability question off the table and let's put on instead the variability question, which is, we understand that renewables and clean energy can be intermittent or variable. What is it that we need to do to make that reliable all the time? And how much is storage going to provide for that? And where do we need to put that? And how can we compete those projects to make them least cost? Those, I think, are the better questions than the reliability. And I think sometimes clean energy advocates feel themselves get defensive when that question is posed right away. So without sort of going down a whole bunch of other holes, I think there's some questions that, what do we do given natural gas stranded asset issues? What do we do about that? How do we pay for that? Securitization is a big question that's going on in a lot of states. We're dealing with it in North Carolina with coal. How much of that should be on the backs of ratepayers? How much of that should be on the backs of utilities? That's a question. How does winter peaking demand increase the energy storage, renewable energy question? The fact that we're no longer on summer peak, but we're going to a winter peaking. And then I think I think that we should come to a national policy for the US. As we have these state by state, years ago, we tried to do carbon cap and trade when Obama was it passed the House, but not the Senate. We're in the same boat now. No one wants a carbon tax, but I think coming with a floor will then feel like everyone is at least on some level playing field. And I think that in terms of being a mover or investor or having certainty, regulatory uncertainty is really difficult in business. And I feel like these are conversations I hear and I'm a part of all the time. I just feel like we have to get to the point of having a national policy. And I'm hoping that we can with Build Back Better, but if we can get over that hump and then agree on what that policy looks like, then there's none of this, well, my state's doing X and your state's doing Y. And I also believe that, SEEM, which is the Southeastern Energy Exchange Market, has been in a conversation. FERC acted on it. A lot of people don't believe that that's the best model to deal with competition and renewable energy deployment on the grid. So that's going to be another conversation. South Carolina is dealing with it now. They're having an energy market reform study. North Carolina does not, despite the fact that Duke Energy is in both states. So all of these are questions for which more certainty, I believe, and some regulatory floor will really help us move everyone in the same direction and dealing with costs that will be left. Who bears them, especially in the states that have poverty. I know I laid a lot of questions out there, and I'm not saying, I'm reading a book in a book club now on climate change law, and it's what is it? The wicked question is what the author starts the whole entire book with, and all of these are wicked questions.
Thank you. Actually, in fact, I remember this way back in the late 90s when we were going through energy deregulation. In fact, I believe it was California that started it. And I don't know if you remember this, there was a whole concept of how do you take care of stranded assets. And a lot of initiatives were put into place. And I basically, much as I would like to see a national policy on it, our joke was that national policy was not going to happen because along with stranded assets, there are things called stranded regulators. That ain't going to happen. They're not going to give up their job. So therefore, by and large, so long as those fiefdoms exist, it's going to be hard to implement a national policy. However, the flip side of that is Smart Grid Initiative grant from the Obama stimulus grants. That pledge around 20 billion, ended up handing out about 8 billion of that, which is the reason why, for example, today you see such widespread smart meters in homes, as well as significant amounts of upgrade to upstream distribution technology. That is one way to do that, because what they effectively did was that, rather than a stick, they initiated the whole carrot, in the sense that if you want money from this, then here are the rules by which you have to play. So that, so in the terms of the infrastructure bill and whatever comes out of the next series of regulations, if you can provide adequate financial incentives, then people will indeed come your way. And by the way, that was another very interesting thing that happened at COP26, which is the whole the net zero emission investment fund commitments from various people. And that one essentially is following the same method, in the sense that so long as people start investing in cleaner technologies, the world will get the message. And in fact, it's very easy. If you go to S&P and look at the performance of these stocks over the last 5 years, you can see that utilities are among the trailing stocks, whereas those companies that are in the renewable energy framework are the ones who are easily beating S&P. So, there are financial incentives that one can provide. So I'm just going to throw it open to all of you. And in fact, I certainly would love to hear from Ali on this one too. Rather than try to have regulations, how do we, rather than sticks, what are the carrots that we can offer people so that we bring them along to the right goal that we want them to be at? Ali, you want to go first?
I'm happy to, and actually, if it's okay, I'll use this to also add a continuation to the question before, because I find it interesting to ask, in the wake of COP, what do decision makers in the energy industry have to think about? And obviously, I really like the answers of the others, and I'm thinking a bit more on like, what should they also get passionate about? And I think some of what we spoke about in terms of like stranded assets, and more generally the question of cleanup of what you leave behind, you need to get passionate about it as a decision maker in this industry, for the sole reason that there is a lot of trust that has been lost. There is a tremendous amount of trust in utilities, in agencies, in governments, in corporations that has been lost, and it's an extremely dangerous place to be in when you're going to face a crisis. We're going to face a climate crisis, and no matter how much we do to mitigate it, there's going to be some extreme events, there's going to be some extreme situations, and having a population that's divided or not trustful of some of the the biggest agencies or biggest institutions is a super dangerous place to be in as a country, as a world. And so I would say, like, this is a bit of a call to get more passionate about these topics, and not only just look at it from the investor and rational side, but saying, is that a situation we want to be in? And the same applies to when it comes to thinking about this just transition. As a decision maker in the energy industry, I'm sure you want to make sure you also have the quality of labor that you've relied on in the past. And so that also makes sure that you keep having good ties with them as you transition, that you keep making sure that their interests are also in there when you're a negotiator and things like that. So just bringing in those ideas of also trust and of being a good social partner, because when you're facing a crisis, you're going to need to make sure your ties are strong before it actually hits that crisis moment. Going back to the question of how do we incentivize, I think regulation is necessary in many cases. So I'll never tell you, don't worry, we'll just incentivize the whole thing. But I do think, at least for the folks I'm dealing with, it's way more about like, how do you make sure workers, folks who have so much to lose in admitting that we need to have a transition, how do you get them to want this transition? And a big part is making the future jobs attractive. Because for now, we often talk about how the future is going to be, for example, a service-based economy. And yet, when you think of the service industry, you don't always think about good, high-paying, dignified jobs. So actually, in all of these places, there's no good, unionization mechanism, and all of these places are difficult working conditions. So making sure that the alternative is attractive, is a role that will facilitate the transition. People will naturally go to a place that is good, and I think that's one of the big ones that I can think of right away from the angle I take this question as.
And I think you talk about focusing events, you know, I've sort of lived through a couple. One is the coal ash spill at the Dan River plant, or Dan River up in the northern part of the state, and coal ash as a whole. I mean, that was a focusing event. I think the closure, the bankruptcy of VC Summer in South Carolina, what a $7-8 billion hole that never got built, on the backs of South Carolina ratepayers thinking about that. And that's what got into the energy conversation. So you know, there have utility focusing events. I think it's just about trying to get to that clean future. So am I echoing?
An echo.
Okay. Hopefully that's better. But those two focusing events, I think, did a lot for conversation about clean energy here in the Carolinas. And I think just, you know, also activated people to think about the fact that those were not the things that they wanted to see going forward. So I wanted to say that in terms of what Ali was saying about kind of getting people to see, you know, what's happening here. How we get around.
Yeah. So Param, can I jump in?
Please, by all means.
Yeah. So yeah, it's quite interesting because some of the discussions happening in US and India is actually there are a lot of similarities, although we are probably at a completely different place in terms of where the grid is. But in India also, I think some of the discussion about stranded assets, I think, has already started to emerge because as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Indian government has been pushing for lots of renewable, and they have scaled up the renewable development, and it is expected to continue where India is looking at getting to almost 4 times where India is right now in terms of the renewable deployment by end of the decade. So that type of a scale up is again unprecedented, especially when you are already at 100+ gigawatt scale. And already there are challenges where many of the thermal plants which were maybe financed just a decade back with a 25-30 year expected life with 70-80% plant load factor are already starting to operate at 50% PLF because with renewables becoming cheaper, they are just not getting dispatched enough. So one of the things I think when many times people start asking about question about stranded asset, I think my at least philosophy is that once you start realizing this or you start seeing these signals similar to how you get out of a hole, first step is stop digging. So stop at least building more assets which you know for sure are going to become stranded asset, not 20 years down the line, but possibly 10 years down the line, rather than trying to fight out and try to say that, oh, next 5 years, some of these technologies may be marginally better or marginally cheaper, and we need to keep on just building those. And I think if we can learn those type of aspects, especially for countries like India, in fact, what is required is not necessarily any handouts financially, but just access to financing, because the scale of investment what is required in India, that is sort of unprecedented. And I think it could be a good win-win partnership because again, there are not too many investments on the energy sector where you can get double-digit returns in most of the developed countries, whereas in India you can easily get because the economy is growing, the energy needs are going to be increasing. And those are the type of conversations which we need to be having rather than thinking about, okay, is India asking for a handout? No, India is not asking for a handout. In fact, it could be a good win-win partnership. And the other aspect is related to manufacturing. I think over the last 2-3 decades, I think the world ended up becoming dependent on China. I think most of the developed countries took the advantage of sort of pushing the emissions, pushing all the environmental effects on China. And now we are realizing after COVID that we cannot have that type of a heavy dependency on any one nation. And with especially these newer technologies, many of these technologies are decentralized. We definitely don't need to have a over reliance on a centralized production just in 1 or 2 countries. And that's where there is going to be a next generation of opportunities for collaboration in terms of knowledge sharing, technology exchange, and all can benefit by the kind of scale up which can happen globally.
Thank you. In fact, yes, in fact, there was, when Narendra Modi declared they need about $1 trillion to make this happen over the next 10 years, there were a lot of people who were quote unquote aghast at that number. Whereas I had to remind them that that is a small fraction of the current subsidiaries of the United States of America alone for the fossil fuel industries, in terms of production tax credits, investment tax credits, and all kinds of other tax credits. So while $1 trillion sounds like a lot of money, in terms of an investment, it is not. And that is exactly the way one should look at it. There's another interesting thing that you mentioned in terms of distributed generation, because a few months ago, I was in one of these seminars and somebody asked me this question: what if you're in the middle of nowhere and we're trying for economic development, however, you're simply, in terms of transmission lines or infrastructure, you don't have anything to go on. How do you kickstart something like that? And my answer was, that is funny because my friends in India are doing exactly that in the middle of nowhere in Jharkhand. So Rahul, you probably can do a better job than I did in terms of describing that one. Could you spend a couple minutes talking about our Jharkhand project?
Sure. Yeah. So again, I think at CES, Customized Energy Solutions, we have always believed in electricity as one of the best tool for economic development. And we launched this initiative in India called Microgrid Initiative for campus and rural opportunities, where we started looking into both. One was how microgrids, which could be at less than like 100 kilowatt scale, can help improve economic activities in some of the remote areas. At the same time, we also were looking into some of the modern townships where sort of tens or hundreds of megawatt scale microgrids, campus grids can help in making townships more grid friendly. So in terms of the economic development activity, we have been working in the state of Jharkhand, where there are many remote areas where people have lots of agricultural produce, but not enough access to electricity to set up agro-processing businesses. And although over the last 3-4 years, government has done an amazing job to get the grid to many of these remote corners of the country, still most of the places the grid is not completely reliable, and if it is available, mainly it's a single phase supply with sufficient energy for just lighting and some home appliances. So we have built a few of these microgrids and set up agro-processing businesses and trying to build a sustainable development model, which can then be taken up even to Africa or some of the other regions where these type of microgrids can be scaled up at a much larger scale.
Thank you. Any comments from anybody else? Otherwise, I will open it up to questions from the audience.
Just briefly on that, if I may, I think a lot of the time there's a baked-in assumption that the one thing those small and remote communities need is a good transmission line to get them the power. And we've just heard the answer to that. But I think one of the reasons that it really landed with me is that at the moment, our team is in the middle of something that is off to one side of being a publication most of the time, and that is a series of conversations that we're facilitating across Canada on how people in different communities, many of them you would consider in the middle of nowhere, although I bet they wouldn't see it that way, right? To look locally at how issues of climate resilience, just transition, and economic insecurity come together. And we aren't hearing from anybody, we need, big mega investment. We need investment in the things that are strong. We aren't hearing we need to become newly reliant or more reliant on centralized generation along a long transmission line that'll probably take 15 years to negotiate and mitigate. We need microgrids. We need local sources of supply. And I can't say this for the United States. I think I can say it for Canada, for many parts of Canada, that grids and grid regulators aren't thinking that way some of the time because they're not used to thinking that way. And once again, that change in perspective, I think, can lead to some really powerful different outcomes.
And certainly, internationally, I mean, Raul mentioned Africa. It's classic. I mean, in places like India and Africa, sunlight is more than abundant, and so microgrids built around solar panels and battery storage, and also connection to the grid. However not reliable it is, you can use all of the three to charge up the batteries and run the machinery in a very consistent pure electric format on DC. So it's significantly improves all of the efficiencies across the board. And these are the communities that you look at are people who are actually processing these things by hand today. I mean, they're actually using harvesting those grains, or in the case of Jharkhand, dal of various kinds, and hand washing them and drying them in the sun for hours on end, and then using mats to get the chaff out and so on and so on. Whereas by this industrialization, you significantly increase the throughput of all of this, and therefore the whole community. So the end result is that the community itself sees its standard of living go up just because you were able to put something like this in place. Which this is a model that can be repeated in the middle of nowhere. So just come up with the right number of right definition and the environment for the middle of nowhere, and we'll be in good shape. We have the technology. So Christina, any questions from the audience?
Thank you, Kumar. Yeah, we have a lot of questions here, very engaged audience, which means that the session's going really well. I am going to open up the mic to Mark Howitt. He's been asking a lot of questions, and Mark, are you online? Hold on. Mark?
Yes, I am. It's Mark Howitt from Store Electric in England, as it happens. Why is the electricity storage debate always only about energy, that is balancing or reliability? Because that ignores grid duration, stability and restoration, which are other parts of the same issue of the energy transition. But by ignoring grid duration, stability and restoration, the only solutions being promoted are batteries which don't deliver those three, like inertial storage does, for example.
Actually, yeah, in fact, we're not ignoring. In fact, very recently, for example, we worked with Green Mountain Energy to implement a Tesla wall, which whole purpose is to play in the regulation markets. So no, that the battery discussion is not being confined to just energy only. It's also all the regulation and ancillary service markets and things like black start. I mean, how much better a black start market do you have than batteries attached to grids, or even electric vehicles attached to the grids? So yes, that very much. In fact, by the way, there are some significant projects of the U.S. Navy, especially in fact, I know of two in Hawaii naval bases where they are trying to get into the whole ancillary service markets. Yeah, that's very much in the discussion. Anybody else want to add something?
Yeah, so Param, I think the question is quite important, but I think rather than phrasing that as a storage or storage technology question, I would put it the other way. It is more about a regulatory question in terms of, do you start valuing inertia or the primary response and create mechanisms where you can incentivize the right technologies to get deployed. I think traditionally the grids were developed and deployed in such a way that, okay, all generation was done through rotating generations, and inertia was considered as a part of a freebie of every generator. And that's where I think there are no clear price signals for identifying and incentivizing that. But there is discussion happening in almost many regions where people are looking at primary response apart from the existing ancillary services, which are mainly focused on secondary or tertiary response or black start or voltage support. So that discussion needs to happen. But as Param mentioned, in fact, ancillary services was actually the first sector which opened up and actually gave a big boost to adoption of energy storage, particularly in North America. In fact, my PhD research at Carnegie Mellon focused on looking at economics of energy storage, where I looked into flywheels as well as sodium sulfur and flow batteries for use in electricity market, and found out that rather than just looking for energy arbitrage type of opportunities for building large scale pumped hydro or other opportunities, you can start deploying energy storage and allowing them to participate in ancillary services, which ended up creating the FERC Order 755 and the revolution which has happened. So I think you raised a very important question, and I think inertia and primary response needs to be tackled. And I think most of the regulators are looking into it, but I'm pretty sure multiple technologies will be able to respond to that.
Thank you, Rahul. Christina?
All right, so next question we have is from Stephen Browning. So Stephen, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask.
Oh, I did. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Partly follows on from Mark's, but initially, to Ali, I don't think as a result of the whole electricity industry's move to a competitive mode, that enough attention is paid to education. What used to be quite extensive sponsorship of students for in electrical engineering, and also research and development. Now, effectively, those two were destroyed by crude regulation in the 1990s of the British industry. And we are desperately in need of serious R&D, especially in DC networks, to make things work. Going on from Mark's point, it is in fact the electrical characteristics of what is a machine, which is each AC system in its entirety, which has to be kept flying at a very precise position, even if bits fall off without warning, including disturbance. It's literally like driving a car up a hill with nothing below you, nothing above you. And if something happens, the steepness of the hill goes up, and faster than you can hit the throttle, you've got to react and hold in position or you will fall off. Sorry, that's about the best analogy I can come up with after 18 years and 35 years in the business of system operation. But it does seem to me that I think I've also seen American utilities have their R&D destroyed by the asset stripping brigade because something went wrong with 1 year's balance sheet. We've got an example of that from an opposite number. So that was one thing. There's a load more points on the I've put on the questions. Also, as Mark may have been with me this morning, on the GB system operator grid forming project, which is to modify or augment every inverter virtually to properly behave as we get rid of the big synchronous spinning horrible machines, which give us a lot more stability than I think a lot of people actually realize. But remembering, when you're going to efficiency, that condensing steam turbines are a terrible waste of energy. And that, let's say, getting rid of the thermal is also quite important. So there you go, lots of inverters in order to connect renewables, storage, interconnectors, DC, but we have to do a lot of work on them electrically in order to keep the system stable with high penetration. So as they say, what does the team think, to quote an old British expression. Thank you, Christina and
Thank you. Christina?
Sure. So we have another question from Len Rosen. How does an escalating price on carbon alter the behavior of utilities as they address climate change and aspire to achieve net zero by 2050? This is open to any of the panelists here.
So
Sorry,
I would
Christina,
say, sorry.
Sorry, Christina, could you repeat that?
Sure. How does an escalating price on carbon alter the behavior of utilities as they address the climate change and aspire to achieve net zero by 2050?
So that's the whole issue. We don't have a carbon market right now. And the lack of a carbon market is one of the reasons for which economically it's difficult to figure out how to make the just transition. So obviously coal has more carbon than natural gas, and as you get into clean energy, it goes to much lower. But if we don't have that, then how do you have price parity, or how do you incentivize for where there is a transition? So along with that, you have shareholder interests with utilities that cooperatives don't have, or munis, for example. So all of that plays in, which is why I'm back to, I personally don't believe that we're going to see a carbon tax at the federal level because of the fact that it says tax. I think we could argue all day long about the fact that it would incentivize. Economists all over the country will say that it's going to incentivize economically the right transition, but politically, I don't think that's ever going to happen, at least in the US. So then we're back to, okay, if we don't have something that will incentivize or, allow that, could we have a carbon market? Well, we have that in many cases. We have the RGGI, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, in the New England area, which has done a great job and incentivized all kinds of trading. So could we have that nationally? We have California market with Oregon and Washington, and I think part of Canada. Again, part of the country. In the Southeast, we're behind the 8 ball. We don't have an ISO or RTO or a market like RGGI. So, and we have more of the coal. So we're like, that's why we're an interesting study in regional variation. But to answer your question, my study was economics, so all my economics professors would all show how it's perfectly Pareto optimal to end up with a carbon tax, but you can still incentivize with a carbon market. And my hope is that we end up doing that. It's just going to be a matter of whether we can see if we get something through Congress.
Yeah, in fact, yes, people don't like taxes, but they seem to like tax credits. So that is another way of phrasing it, which is effectively give certain kinds of tax credits, which is only available to certain kinds of energy sources, which already exists because the fossil fuel industry, oil and gas, subject to a whole bunch of tax credits, which is not available to today's renewable power plants.
And you're going to end up in Congress with the solar and the wind credits are going to expire in what it goes from 26 to 22. And this is what I mean about predictability. Business needs predictability. They have to have regulatory certainty. And so when you constantly have these investment production tax credits renewed at the end of the year, oh, we're going to renew next year. If you're a business person and you're looking at projects, you want to lock in funding. You don't want to have it constantly done year by year by year. You want to have it predictable. And, we don't have a storage tax credit right now nationally. Certain states do. I think Maryland is one of them. And again, battery, we have a solar storage combined credit if you have, but we don't have a standalone one. So that is a problem. So in all of these cases, both the tax or the carbon market or the credit, it's not uniform. It's technology specific. It's phased down over time, but we're not leveling the playing field. We're not making things predictable. So that is absolutely more complex to all of these conversations. And you wonder why people act the way they do. It's because, the signals are not there or they're uneven.
Yeah.
We've had a lot
just to add, sorry, Mitch, go ahead.
Go ahead, I'll go after you.
Okay. No, so I just wanted to add on that. Dan, I'm not sure if the statistics are still true, but I remember some of the studies by my former colleagues at CMU, where they had actually shown that sometimes actually the threat of expiry of tax credit is actually a very good incentive for getting things done on ground, because many times I think just before the scheduled deadline, I think you end up seeing a lot of market activity. But I agree completely that I think a long-term stability for particularly driving investing in manufacturing or other long-term price signals are very much required. Otherwise, you end up missing out on that opportunity. But the other aspect, what we need to see it also, I think some of these taxes or credits, are they serving the right purpose, or are they also creating a distortion? For example, it has happened with wind many times, where with the PTC or other thing, effectively for wind, the marginal price has become negative. So we have started seeing in many market regions emergence of negative prices. Now, instead of that, you may need to think about maybe smarter regulations or taxes, which also start valuing maybe when this energy is being generated, rather than just saying that all clean energy, irrespective of when it is generated, get the same credit. I think one study which some of my colleagues did, particularly in Massachusetts, was to look at clean peak standards. I think it is a very good experimentation. So CES team was involved in creating the clean peak standards, and that is creating a right incentive where identifying that yes, there is a problem that the energy used for meeting the peaking demand is the dirtiest, and if you can use renewable energy and add storage or use anything else to try to make it available to offset the peak power, then you get additional incentives. So those type of, I think, mechanisms need also to get wider publicity, so that other states can start adopting such smart regulations.
Just quickly, we've had a lot of experience with carbon pricing in Canada. We ended up arguing and fighting and literally litigating about it for a decade or so. And for a lot of that time, it felt like it was such an intense argument that it was taking up all the oxygen in the room, and we couldn't talk about any of the other things on the climate and energy agenda, which, yeah, got as frustrating as I'm making it sound at times. But we didn't call it a tax either, for the same reason. It would have been political suicide for anybody who advocated it. Anybody who opposed it, of course, tried to rebrand carbon pricing as a carbon tax. So watch out for that when you get there. We've ended up in Canada with the language of a price on pollution. And of course, that is something that applies far beyond carbon pollution, you know, and the idea that you put a higher price on things that you don't want is, you know, pretty well established in a lot of different domains. We ended up setting a floor price on carbon at the federal level, and that got at the kind of patchwork issue that you've mentioned a couple of times, Diane, that in Canada between 2006 and 2015, and I'm going to say this in the most nonpartisan way possible, because this is being partisan against an utter neglect and hostility toward climate action, and it is not partisanship for or against any particular political party. It just happened to be the same government in power over a decade. The result of that was that with the federal government in Canada completely abandoning the field, different provincial governments went their own way and took their own steps. And we did end up with, I don't remember the percentage right now, but quite a large proportion of our population living in provinces that had each taken a slightly different approach to carbon pricing by the time the federal government came to power on a promise to actually, you know, get a national climate plan in place. As our new prime minister said at the time, it was something else because it's 2015. But it helped, and it helps with the kind of situation you're seeing in Reggie. I mean, I was going to say seeing right now, but we see it forever. You know, all the time. A new government has just formed in one of the states. One of the first things to do, the new governor announced was that Virginia now is going to pull out of Reggie. You know, elsewhere, a new governor will take, right? You know, and I cannot imagine. Go ahead. Somebody enlighten me about, you know, how an institution can have, you know, never mind the investors having any certainty. Yeah. You know, do you know that the agency you're with is going to have enough resources to keep employing you when somebody elected on a 2 or 4 year cycle is going to take you out? So having that consistency across the country has helped.
Well, I was going to say, yeah, so Governor Youngkin is new in Virginia, and he has gone on record saying that he would like to get Virginia out of RGGI. There's been no politics or no political statement about the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Again, which, Governor Northam wasn't reelected. So, and Virginia has one of the most far-reaching clean energy laws in the country, certainly in the Southeast. So I think in all of it, it just becomes, we have this system where we elect people every 4 years. And if you're, you can just see what happened with the Paris Accord. We're out of the Paris Accord, we're back in the Paris Accord. One of the things we're dealing with on the Southeast is the fact that Trump had an offshore oil ban, which has been implemented to include offshore wind. And we have several spots in the Southeast for which a project in Virginia, a project about to be finished in Kitty Hawk, another one, Wilmington East. We've got to get that off the books as of July 1. It can't happen in executive order. It has to happen in legislation. It's part of the Build Back Better law. If we don't get that passed, what happens to July 1st if we don't have the wind projects offshore permitted and ready to go? We're going to be up against that executive order that Trump had. So we're constantly in this cleaning up, trying to get stuff done. But you think about the project certainty, you've got these investors, you've got these clean energy companies trying to do these projects, and this regulatory, up and down, it's just very hard. So I'll just stop there.
Two just really quick points if I can come back on that. First of all, that yes, we're seeing the up and down here as well, lately at the provincial level. And it stops being politicized, or at least you can start taking it out of being politicized at the point when everybody can see themselves in the picture. Whether it is investors who can see why, sure, of course this makes sense. Why would I do anything else? Utilities can see where the benefit is. And once again, customers, stakeholders can see that this transition is a good opportunity and gain that loss and pain. It's easier said than done, and partly because what that means is going to be different for each group that you're dealing with. But that is what will sort of get us out of this place where, yes, everywhere the work is vulnerable every 4 years or whatever the electoral cycle is. The only other point I'd like to come back to is that we've been talking about carbon pricing, carbon taxing. I said the terrible word. Let's be clear about including methane as well, because methane is a greenhouse gas that is 80 or 85 times as potent as CO2 over the 20-year span, when we're all going to be scrambling to get this global crisis and local and national and everywhere crisis under control. And there's been some talk on this webinar about gas. If that's fracked gas, it's a methane bomb. And I'm purposely saying that quickly and controversially because I know we're out of time to go into detail on it. So I'll say it at the very end. But seriously, if whatever regime you have, whether it's pricing, whether it's taxation, regulation, whatever it is, if you somehow manage to leave out methane, it's not a climate plan, or at least it's not a complete climate plan. You're not done yet until you fully recognize how essential, how urgent it is to get fracked gas under control. When the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a science report in August, they identified methane controls as pretty much the first and most important thing we need to do between now and 2030 and really get it right.
Thank you, Mitch. We are almost out of time. So in fact, I was actually going to, in the next 1 minute left, I didn't think that we wanted to get into the most contentious issue of COP26, which is indeed called Article 6. For those of you who wanted, for those of you who want to read about Article 6, yeah, please go ahead. There is actually a good description of that, of all the challenges. I mean, you saw how contentious the issue is in a few states in the Southeast. Now, take that problem and try to do it across the world, across 192 nations. Yeah, you have some idea of how complex the problem is and how crazy the discussions are. With that, we're almost out of time. I want to thank all of you for taking the time, and wonderful discussion. We should do this again real soon. Perhaps narrowing down on some of the more interesting aspects of the next steps, especially in the light of some of the legislation that we expect to come out of Washington, D.C. which should certainly make the discussion more concrete and more interesting. With that, back to you, Christina.
Thank you, Kumar, and thank you, panelists. Great presentation. We have a lot of questions that we didn't get to from the audience, so those questions will be posted on Energy Central, and we will also send them out to the panelists to respond. For our audience, we hope you enjoyed today's discussion. As you log off, if you can please take a moment to complete our survey and give us your feedback so that we can continue to provide you with quality content. And thank you for attending. And this concludes our presentation. Have a good day.
Thank you.